A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Koh, the Minister of State for Trade and Industry, Senior Minister of State for Trade and Industry. I'm not going to give you his bio, it's in the program. In any case, he has had such a distinguished career, both in medical practice and as a political office holder, that it will take half an hour to go through all his list of achievements. But for those of you who do not know, we celebrated our 54th year of independence just a few days ago. I know those of you from Iran, 54 years is not even a blink of an eyelid, it's nothing, right? But for us, 54 years is a big deal. But the point is that for all our political leaders, August is therefore a very busy month, and I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Koh from taking time from his busy schedule and busier schedule to be with us this morning. I also want to acknowledge an old friend, Rich Armitage, who came a very long way, Dr. Kazem Sajapur, and MJ Akbar, another old friend who came here, and they are among our keynote speakers. Well, you did not come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to Dr. Koh. So without further ado, can I invite Dr. Koh to come on the stage and deliver his opening remarks. Thank you, Dr.
Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of Middle East Institute, Mr. Richard Armitage, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Dr. Kazem Sajapur, President, Institute for Political and International Studies, and former Ambassador of Iran to the United Nations in Geneva, Mr. MJ Akbar, former Indian Minister of State for External Affairs, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. It's a pleasure for me to join you here this morning at this conference. Now let me start by commending Mr. Bilahari and his team for putting this conference together. I know it's still early in the morning and some of the people are probably still in bed, that's why some of the empty seats are there. This is quite a scary prospect in this 7th lunar month in Singapore. We call it the Hungry Ghost Festival. So every empty seat sometimes can be viewed with a little bit of suspicion. But the topic of our discussion today is especially timely and rather salient as well, given the recent development and some of the events happening in the Strait of Hormuz, which have presented great difficulties for the parties involved. They are also a cause of concern, very much concern to the international community. Now, the situation we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz today did not actually appear in a vacuum. Relations between Iran and the West have been difficult, marked by decades of uneasy coexistence and sometimes conflict. In particular, the past 40 years have seen a steady decline in US-Iran relations. So the topic of today, as you see at the board behind me, is a very timely and important one that I'm sure many of us here will be interested to hear the views of our other speakers as well. Tensions have recently ratcheted up while trust between the two nations has eroded, especially with the imposition of sanctions. I shall not pretend to be an expert on historical origins of friction between the US and Iran. There are many more eminent experts sitting among us here today. Nor shall I pretend to be fully understand all the intricacies of the JCPOA. Now, let me just say that Singapore do not take sides in this complicated relationship or on this very complex issue. Instead, I thought for the purpose of this conference, I'd like to focus on the broader implications of the ongoing tensions and some of the fundamental principles at stake. So hopefully that can focus and frame some of the discussions in today's meeting. Singapore, like many others, is deeply concerned about the escalating tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait is flanked by the biggest oil producers in the Middle East and remains one of the busiest and most important waterways in the global oil trade. It is a vital global oil choke point through which a fifth of global oil transits or an estimated 21 million barrels of oil per day in 2018. Now, even without an outright conflict, prolonged tensions and instability in the Strait of Hormuz will have a detrimental impact on the global oil supply and the global economy. The likely upward pressure on oil prices will compound an already weakening global economy. And if you catch the news this morning, we have also downgraded Singapore's economic forecast for this year to between 0% and 1%. The IMF had previously estimated a 20% increase in oil prices could lead to a 0.5% to 1.5% decline in global GDP. Amidst the ongoing trade tensions, global economic growth is forecast at a mere 3.2% this year. This marks the slowest global growth since the 2008 financial crisis. Growth in trade volume has also declined to about 0.5% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2019 alone, after having dropped below the 2% mark at the fourth quarter of 2018. Let's just say that any actual disruption to oil transiting through the Hormuz Strait would hit Asia the hardest. Why do we say that? Well, because 76% of crude oil and condensates which pass through the strait are actually bound for Asian markets, including China, Japan, India, and South Korea. As continued tit-for-tat measures will only serve to increase the risk of miscalculation and conflagration, it is in the interest of all parties to avoid escalating tensions or precipitating confrontations in such a vital global oil choke point. For Singapore, the issue at stake is not just about the Hormuz Strait, but what it portends for other international waterways and international order in general. Singapore has strong interests in ensuring that sea lines of communication remain open, free, and secure for peaceful and unhindered travel by commercial vessels. This year, we celebrate and commemorate the Singapore Bicentennial, marking 200 years since the British East India Company established a free port here in Singapore, a significant turning point in our history. And since then, for the past 200 years, trade has been a lifeblood of our economy and remains so to this day, where merchandise trade is consistently at least 2 to 3 times our GDP. The fact is, our standing today as a vibrant and thriving global maritime hub would not have been possible without continued access to secure and open trade routes along our sea lines of communication, namely the Strait of Malacca on the one hand and the South China Sea on the other. Freedom of navigation is therefore of fundamental interest to us, and indeed the rest of the world economy as well. All of us should therefore seek to avoid a world where conflicts between littoral states and external powers threaten international sea lines of communications, to impede global trade and jeopardize our collective livelihood. Let me now offer some thoughts on how we see the way forward. First, the overriding priority must be to de-escalate the situation and to defuse tensions. We urge all parties to exercise restraint and to avoid further unilateral actions that may serve to undermine the freedom and security of commercial vessels passing through the Hormuz Strait. At the same time, vessels should also ensure that they comply fully with navigational rules meant to ensure the safety of all users. Second, we encourage parties to return to the negotiating table. Diplomacy and dialogue are key to reinstating stability, as opposed to force or even the threat of force. Any long-term solution must be rules-based and take into account the interests of all relevant parties. Now, such a process, however, takes considerable effort, perseverance, and compromise and giving weight to the core interests of other parties, as we all know, is never an easy task. Nonetheless, a conducive and friendly international environment is ultimately beneficial for all parties in the longer term. The fundamental principle is that international agreements, once signed, should be honored. then this is a key interest to small states like Singapore. This principle is the foundation of certainty and stability in the international order. From this perspective, the JCPOA, although certainly not perfect and did not erase the mistrust between Iran and the United States or resolve long-standing issues, nevertheless helped manage differences and de-escalate tensions. It was a delicately balanced accord which breached the interests of all parties, and in the long run may have served to build confidence between the parties directly involved. So for these reasons, the JCPOA was welcomed by many in the international community, including Singapore. Singapore is not situated along the Strait of Hormuz, nor are we party to the JCPOA, but we hope that all parties will act with pragmatism to resolve tensions amicably. A peaceful and stable Strait of Hormuz, which remains conducive for trade, is ultimately in everyone's interest. Singapore will continue to monitor the major developments very closely and will be pragmatic in taking the necessary steps to safeguard our national interests. It is our hope that the US and Iran, along with the other members of the international community, can continue to work towards a solution founded in rules. This conference has brought together many distinguished experts and former policymakers in the international area. I thank you for making your way here to Singapore to join us in this very important dialogue. Almost all the parties that are involved in this conference are represented in this conference. Although their views may not represent those of governments, I'm hopeful that the discussions today will be balanced, insightful, and at least offer us a glimpse of the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the world we live in today is extremely unpredictable, and countries should work together to maximize our chances of acting in wisdom and opt for openness, peace, and cooperation so as to preserve and expand progress which we have made collectively over the last few decades. Let me take this chance to thank all of you, especially our visitors from afar, for joining us this morning, and I wish all of you a very fruitful time here in Singapore discussing on this very challenging issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, SMS Co, for that thought-provoking message. Can I invite you now to join our chairman for the question and answer session?
Dr. Koh has about 20 minutes or so to take questions. So without further ado, may I have the first question? Or maybe I will ask the first question. Dr. Koh, you alluded briefly to the impact on the global economy and on Singapore. Could you elaborate a bit on this?
Now, as I said earlier in my speech, any of these instability to the global order will impact sentiments for economic investments and trade. And you heard what I said earlier, that the IMF has already given a prediction that the global GDP growth would slow down to 3.2% for 2019. This is despite the fact that the International Energy Agency has given assurance that there's enough emergency oil stocks to weather any of these extended periods of disruption. So clearly, all these downside risks have increased over the recent few months, not just the US-China trade conflict, but conflicts in the Strait of Hormuz. Japan, Korea also has got some convulsions happening recently in the East China Sea. And you add all this together, it really makes the business sentiments much more of a negative one. So global economy goes down a little bit. And Singapore, being very exposed and an open economy to the larger global trading system, would naturally be impacted as well, which is why we also take into account this increase in downside risk to moderate our own prediction of our GDP growth for this year. And that is at the larger economic level. But for the region in which we reside in Asia, as I said, 76% of the global oil trade that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is actually meant for the Asian markets, big economies like China, India, Japan, and Korea. So any disruption there would again impact these regional economies, which again will have spillover effect to us in this region as well. But when you look at it at the national level, I would say that sectorally in the oil trading sector in Singapore, I think the impact probably is manageable because many of these companies in the oil trading sector will have taken into account some of these uncertainties and diversified their sources of oil supply. So they are probably able to hedge some of this, and the impact of this conflict in the Strait of Hormuz can be manageable in the oil trading sector. But any form of escalation or conflict will lead potentially to an increase in oil prices. And that can have some spillover effects to specific sectors. So in the chemicals industry, for example, an increase in feedstock costs will increase the cost of their production. Perhaps in the transport sector, as well as in the power generation sector, this will be impacted as well. And somewhat will translate down to probably inflationary pressure on the cost to consumers. Electricity prices and tariffs may go up. So for certain sectors, the spillover effect will impact some of our consumers in terms of inflation. But for other sectors, if the oil prices should go up, maybe in the rig building sector, oil prices going up may portend some increased opportunities for investments to sectors that are thriving in the oil and gas sector. So they may then get increased demand for investments coming in for exploration. But I would say on the whole, any of these uncertainties will increase the downside risk and impact the economic forecast for Singapore somewhat in a negative way.
Thanks, Dr. Koh. I already have one question, but just two quick ground rules. Please move to the microphone when you ask your question. And secondly, to maximize time, please make sure your question is a question and not a speech in disguise. Thank you, Tommy. And identify yourself, please. That doesn't apply to Tommy Koh because everybody knows him.
Dr. Po, I'm Tommy Koh. I work for Bilahari. Thank you for a very wise and balanced keynote. We have many friends here from the United States and from Iran. What is the message you would like to convey to those two great countries?
You want to take all the questions first, or we take it one at a time?
Up to you. Maybe we take a couple and then then you take it.
Yeah.
Doctor.
Minister, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the One Belt, One Road project. As I know, Singapore joins this and very actively. And also, China-Singapore have very good cooperation on the innovation, high tech. Your deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Wang, just in Shanghai, joined the Innovating Summit and gave a very wonderful speech. So could you introduce something about this, the cooperation between China and Singapore on One Belt, One Road and high-tech innovating? Thank you.
Thank you. That was Dr. Pang Guan from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. Maybe we'll answer these two questions.
Okay, well, the first question from Professor Tommy Koh, what would I think is something that is important for US and Iran to consider? I would say that we are all within this global community together. What impacts the world in a broader sense, where the downside risk to the economy goes up, will eventually impact all of us. So I think it's important for us to continue not to escalate the tension further, to look for ways to de-escalate, and come back to the negotiating table and find a way out collectively. While the past may be complicated and it's probably quite difficult in the short term to unravel decades of animosity, misunderstanding, and mistrust, I think it's important to look forward and see what are the common spaces in which we can work together. Look for areas in which we can build common trust. Take small steps, but take some steps. And I think that would be something that will augur well for the rest of the world as well. For the One Belt, One Road collaboration, I think it is a reflection of Singapore's participation in this project. It's a reflection of our desire to ensure that multilateral trading systems, multilateral relationships continue to prosper. That we want to make sure that everybody participates in projects that brings mutual benefits. So it is about structuring a project that makes sure it's bankable, make sure that it is something that brings benefits to the country in which the investment goes to. Well, we are not the ones doing the investment, neither are we the one that is pushing for this, but we believe that we can play a useful role to help to catalyze projects in a meaningful way that can help countries that are participating in this project together. So at least for Asia, Singapore has set up an Infrastructure Asia office. In this sense, we're leveraging on a financial ecosystem, we're leveraging on the multilateral development banks that are based in Singapore as well, to also size up the needs of many of the developing nations within Asia, and helping to bring technical expertise to structure projects so that these actually deliver tangible benefits to the recipient countries as well. And I think by participating in this way, whether it's through technology cooperation, whether it's through business-to-business interactions, we want to unlock benefits for everybody collectively. Ultimately, a rising tide hopefully will float all ships. And if our neighbors do well, and if our trading partners do well, we also benefit together in this global community.
Thanks. Shikata-san, did you have a question? First, Shikata-san and Julia. Huh?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Your Excellency, let me ask you about the impact of shale oil and gas. Some countries say that because of the rising production of shale oil and gas, Middle East is less important. I don't think so. My original background is a petrochemical business. So I believe oil and gas in the Middle East are most price competitive and have high quality. Therefore, the peace and security in the Middle East is quite important for all the countries, including the United States. So how do you look upon the future of the Middle East as energy supply? Thank you very much.
Well, I would say that today is not just about shale oil and gas, it's also about renewable energy. So many countries are also diversifying in their energy mix, not just only onto other sources of supply apart from the Middle East. They are also looking at introducing other energy components like renewable energy sources as well into their mix. So increasingly, I think people are looking at a more sustainable way of developing their economy, not just diversifying from a particular source per se, but clearly with the US now producing more shale oil and gas, that has posed some challenges to some of the oil-producing countries traditionally as well. And you can see the correlation between prices of crude oil from the Middle East and shale oil and gas that fluctuates with the prices. As one price goes up, the other becomes more, I suppose, attractive to produce. And that will then create some downside pressure on the other sources. And I think the world is trying to come to balance with this kind of competing sources of oil and gas. Many of those in the oil trading sector would know how to hedge some of these fluctuations. And today, many of the oil traders will look for diversified sources away from the Middle East as well, and that includes US shale gas and oil as a potential source of supply.
Julia? I know you, Julia, but can you introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you, Ambassador. My name is Julia Roknifard. I represent Emir Research. It's a Kuala Lumpur-based think tank. I find this opportunity very good to ask you, Minister, about how actually anti-Iranian sanctions are working in Southeast Asia, in particular in Singapore and our neighbor in Malaysia. Because even though Singapore probably hasn't joined the anti-Iranian sanctions on the governmental level, but I'm sure you know that they've been working on the level of businesses because partially the explanation provided to those businesses was quite good, that they need to avoid risks or at least try to minimize them. So for example, denying holders, I'm not talking even about businesses, just holders of Iranian passports, denying them various services without explanation provided. The recent case in Singapore was OCBC Bank, which was closing down the accounts of Iranian nationals. Back in Malaysia, it's CIMB and Maybank. So do you pay attention to this? What's your opinion on that? And don't you see that as a sort of insult to your sovereignty? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Now, let me just say that Singapore is a member of the United Nations, and we impose sanctions that are actually registered with the UN Security Council. And in fact, we have taken effect some of these UNSC resolutions into our domestic legislations as well. So these UNSC sanctions and regulations have been given effect in our domestic legislation. So we do not act on unilateral sanctions. They are not part of the UNSC Security Council sanctions. But having said that, we must be realistic that businesses actually do take into account some of these global developments in their commercial decision-making based on their own commercial interests. But what my ministry does, and the Ministry of Trade Industry, is that we work with trade associations, we work with the Singapore Customs to share some of these regular updates with our business community, to also provide some advisory for them. But ultimately, because the businesses take on the business risks themselves, we have to give them the leeway to make commercial decisions based on their own calculations. But I would just categorically say that Singapore do not impose unilateral sanctions. We are just abide by what the UN Security Council mandates.
I'm Sher Zaman, Linkers Far East. My company is dealing in petrochemicals. Singapore companies know quite well about Iran, about the business opportunities there, and Iranian companies also understands well. So the main problem is that with all these sanctions and the restrictions by the banks, business is not taking place. Is there any possibility that we can facilitate some business in currencies other than US dollars?
Now, these questions boils down to how businesses see their risks. And also, banks are also businesses. And the banks must also take into account how they want to navigate the system. The European Union, of course, especially signatories to the JCPOA, are continuing to try and get the JCPOA to be effective and to work. And that is something that augurs well in the sense that as long as the parties are continuing to find a solution to work on it, there is probably an option for other entities to provide a platform for trade to continue. But it is something that individual businesses have to take into account some of the risks, because ultimately, the government cannot be the one to bail out the risks for businesses making commercial decisions. So this is something that will have to continue to evolve. What we will continue to do is to share updates, to share advisories, so that businesses can make better decisions in trying to calculate the risk.
We have time for perhaps 2 questions before Dr. Koh has to go. Kevin?
Morning, Dr. Koh. I'm Kevin from Tel Aviv University. I just wanted to follow up on Julia's question. So Singapore, I think on the 22nd and 24th of July, actually seized 2 ships, the Gas Infinity and the Sea Dragon, if I remember the names correctly, carrying petroleum products from Iran, I think it was, towards China. These were Chinese ships owned by the Bank of Koh Poh Koon. One of them was released, I think it was the Sea Dragon, which then turned back towards the Strait of Hormuz. Could you perhaps elaborate on the rationale behind that move? Was that within... Anyway, please, yes.
To be honest, I'm not very clued in onto the actual details of this particular case itself, so I'm afraid I can't give you a specific answer to that.
Would that, though, very briefly, would that have fallen within framework of any, well, that seemed to me at least, that it was implemented in the framework of US sanctions. So I think that comes across.
Like I said, anything we say now will be speculative because I don't have the case details with me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, who wants to ask the final question before we wrap this one up and say goodbye to the Minister? Well, if there are no further questions, then please join me in thanking the Minister for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much.